The rejected Omega found 3 wolves outside her door. They were the Alpha King's missing sons. The rain had not stopped for 3 days when Elira Voss heard the scratching at her door. She lived at the edge of Blackthorn territory, far from the pack houses and the training grounds, in a small wooden cabin surrounded by herb gardens. Most wolves in the pack barely remembered her name. The ones who did remember her only for one thing. 3 years ago, in front of the whole pack, her fated mate had rejected her. He had looked into her eyes and said the words that broke the bond between them, and he had done it in public, where everyone could watch her fall apart. After that night, Elira stopped going to gatherings. She stopped waiting for invitations that never came. She built a quiet life instead, growing herbs, healing small wounds for anyone who wandered close enough to ask, and keeping her heart locked away where no one could reach it again. The scratching came again, softer this time, almost desperate. Elira set down her cup of tea and walked to the door. When she opened it, the storm rushed in, cold and wet, and at her feet she found 3 wolf pups, shivering, thin, and barely able to lift their heads. "Oh," she whispered, kneeling down at once. "Oh, you poor things." They were small, no more than a few weeks old, their fur soaked and matted with mud, but even in that state, something about them struck her. Their eyes, when they opened them weakly to look at her, were an unusual color, amber ringed with silver, a shade she had never seen on any wolf in the territory. She did not think twice. She gathered them into her arms and carried them inside, closing the door against the storm. That night, Elira fed the pups warm broth from a small dropper, 1 drop at a time, and wrapped them in the softest blankets she owned. She sat beside them until dawn, watching their small chests rise and fall, praying they would survive the night. By morning, all 3 pups were breathing steadily, and for the first time since she had found them, they opened their eyes fully and looked at her without fear. "You're going to be all right," she told them softly. "I promise." She did not know yet how much that promise would come to mean. Over the following weeks, Elira cared for the pups as if they were her own. She had no mate, no pack standing, and no resources beyond what she earned from her small herb trade, but she gave them everything she had. She learned their personalities quickly. The oldest of the 3, a firm and steady pup she began calling Bran, always positioned himself between his brothers and any stranger who approached. The middle pup, quick and clever, she named Torin, and he was always the first to explore every corner of the cabin. The youngest, gentle and quiet, she called Sael, and he stayed close to Elira's side more than his brothers did, as if he sensed she needed the comfort as much as he did. It was one afternoon, while she was combing the tangles from Torin's fur, that she noticed something strange. Just behind his left ear, hidden beneath a thick patch of fur, was a small crescent-shaped mark. She had seen a mark like it before, only once, in an old book of pack history that had belonged to her grandmother. The book spoke of a royal bloodline, one that had ruled Blackthorn territory for generations, always marked by a crescent behind the ear. Her hands went still. She checked the other 2 pups that same night, working carefully through their fur by candlelight. Bran had the mark, so did Sael. Elira sat back against the wall of her cabin, her heart pounding. She knew the story, as did everyone in the pack, though it was rarely spoken aloud. 10 years ago, the Alpha King's mate had been killed, and his 3 infant sons had vanished the same night. The pack had searched for years, following false leads and empty rumors, but the boys were never found. Most wolves believed they were dead. The Alpha King himself, it was said, had never stopped searching, even after everyone else had given up hope. Could it be possible? Could these 3 pups, found starving at her door in the middle of a storm, be the missing sons of the Alpha King? She spent that whole night pacing her small cabin, torn between fear and hope. If she was right, these boys were the most important pups in the entire territory, heirs to the Alpha King himself. If she was wrong, she risked drawing dangerous attention to herself and to them for nothing. And there was another fear too, one she barely allowed herself to think. If the pack discovered where the boys had been hiding, would they take the boys away from her the moment she told the truth? She thought of the years of loneliness since her rejection, the quiet ache of being unwanted, and how these 3 small pups had somehow filled a space in her heart she thought would stay empty forever. The thought of losing them terrified her. But she also thought of the Alpha King, a father who had spent 10 years searching for his sons, never knowing if they were alive or dead. She thought of how it would feel to carry that grief for a decade, and she knew she could not keep the truth to herself, no matter what it cost her. The next morning, she wrapped the pups warmly and set out toward the healer's house on the outskirts of the main pack territory. She trusted the old healer, a woman named Mirella, who had treated her wounds after the rejection without judgment or pity. Mirella took one look at the pups and went very still. "Where did you find these boys?" she asked quietly. "At my door," Elira said. "3 nights ago, during the storm." Mirella knelt down and gently examined the crescent marks behind their ears, her hands trembling slightly. When she looked up at Elira, her eyes were wet. "Elira," she said, "I believe these are the Alpha King's sons." The words, spoken aloud by someone else, made the truth feel suddenly real and enormous. Elira's throat tightened. "What do I do?" she whispered. "You must tell him," Mirella said, "today, if you can. He deserves to know his sons are alive." Elira hesitated, and Mirella seemed to understand the fear behind her silence. "You are afraid they will take the boys and forget you," Mirella said gently. "But you saved their lives. No one who truly knows what that means could ever forget the person who did that." Elira nodded slowly, though the fear did not fully leave her chest. Word of the discovery could not be kept quiet for long. By the time Elira made her way back toward her cabin, whispers had already begun to spread through the pack. A traveling tracker, someone who had once worked for a rival pack years ago during the time of the kidnapping, had recently returned to Blackthorn territory, asking strange questions about old debts and old secrets. When he heard the rumors about 3 pups with crescent marks found near the outskirts, he understood immediately what they meant and what they threatened. If the true heirs were found alive, certain old arrangements made in the chaos after the Alpha King's mate died would be exposed, and certain wolves, who had profited from the boy's disappearance, would be in danger. That same day, the Alpha King, Kaelan Blackthorn, received a message from Mirella that made him leave his fortress without waiting for his enforcers to gather. Kaelan had spent 10 years as a hardened, quiet ruler, carrying his grief privately because a king was not permitted to fall apart in front of his pack. He had followed 100 false leads over the years, and each one had worn away a little more of his hope. But something about this message, written in Mirella's careful hand, made his chest ache with a feeling he had almost forgotten how to feel. He rode toward the outskirts alone, his heart pounding harder with every mile. At the same time, unaware of how quickly events were unfolding, Elira reached her cabin and found her rejected mate, Doran, waiting outside her door. He had been assigned by the Pack Council to investigate the rumors, since he was a rising enforcer and happened to patrol the outskirts. Elira froze at the sight of him. The last time they had stood this close, he had rejected her in front of everyone, humiliating her completely. Now here he was again, standing at her door. "I heard about the pups," Doran said, his voice careful. "Is it true?" "It's true," Elira said, lifting her chin. She would not let old shame make her small in this moment. "They are safe inside. I've cared for them since I found them." Doran studied her for a long moment, something unreadable in his expression. "I never should have shamed you the way I did," he said quietly. "Whatever happens today, I want you to know that." Elira did not have time to respond, because at that moment, 3 armed strangers emerged from the tree line behind Doran, moving fast and with clear intent. The rogue tracker had sent men to silence the truth before it could reach the Alpha King. Doran turned instantly, shifting into his wolf form to meet the threat, but the attackers were prepared for exactly this. One of them struck Doran hard, knocking him back into the mud, while the other 2 moved toward the cabin door where the pups were hidden. Elira did not think. She threw herself in front of the door, blocking their path with her own small body. "You will not touch them," she said, her voice shaking but firm. The attackers laughed, unimpressed by an Omega standing in their way. But when one of them reached for her, something inside Elira broke open, a strength she had never known she carried. Her grandmother's stories had always spoken of an old, forgotten bloodline of protectors. wolves whose power only surfaced when someone they loved was in mortal danger. But as the attacker's hand closed around her arm, a fierce, burning power surged through her, and she fought back with a strength that surprised even herself, holding her ground long enough for Doran to recover and rejoin the fight. It was in that same moment that Cailan Blackthorn arrived, drawn by an instinct he could not explain, arriving just as the fight reached its most dangerous point. He saw his enforcer struggling. He saw an unfamiliar Omega fighting fiercely to protect something behind a cabin door, and he saw, through the open doorway, 3 small wolf pups huddled together with crescent marks behind their ears. Everything in him went still, and then everything in him moved at once. Cailan joined the fight with the full force of 10 years of buried grief and fury, and within minutes, the attackers were subdued. The rogue tracker's men, realizing they were outmatched, fled into the trees, though Cailan's enforcers, arriving moments later, caught 2 of them before they could escape the territory. When the danger had passed, Cailan walked slowly toward the cabin, his hands shaking. He knelt down in front of the 3 pups, who peered out cautiously from behind Elira's legs. Bran, he whispered, though he had never been told that name. Torin, Sael. The names came to him not from memory, but from something deeper, an ancient bond between a father and his sons that had never fully broken, even across 10 years of silence. The pups, sensing something important in his voice, stepped forward hesitantly. Cailan reached out with trembling hands and gently touched the crescent marks behind their ears, marks he had once kissed goodnight when they were only days old. Tears he had not allowed himself to shed in 10 years finally fell. "Thank you," he said, turning to Elira, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for keeping them alive. Thank you for keeping them safe." Elira, exhausted and trembling from the fight, could only nod, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. In the days that followed, the truth was confirmed through an old blood bond ritual performed by Mirella, proving without doubt that Bran, Torin, and Sael were indeed the Alpha King's long-lost sons. The pack, stunned by the news, could not stop speaking of the rejected Omega who had saved the heirs of Blackthorn from a storm and from those who wished them harm. The pups, having imprinted deeply on Elira during their most vulnerable days, refused to be separated from her, clinging to her whenever anyone tried to take them elsewhere for their formal care. Cailan, watching this, made a decision that surprised his entire council. "She stays," he said simply, "not as a servant and not as a stranger. She stays as their guardian, and as someone this pack owes a debt it can never fully repay." Elira, the Omega who had once believed she would never belong anywhere, found herself standing at the center of the restored royal family, no longer defined by the shame of rejection, but by the love of 3 small boys who called her the one who saved them, and by a king who looked at her now not with pity, but with quiet, growing gratitude that felt very much like the beginning of something new. For the first time in 3 years, Elira allowed herself to hope that her story was not over, but only just beginning,